Today, we're going to look at one of the most frustrating aspects of Congress. We're going to look at elections in Congress. And I say that these are frustrating because one of the things we're going to learn today is that in general, Americans tend to be very dissatisfied with Congress and the job that they do. However, almost all of the congressmen who run for reelection get reelected. And so we're going to take a look at some of the factors that allow for those who currently hold power to stay in power. So our objective today, we're going to describe the factors that impact congressional elections. We're going to go through lots of different things that have an influence on the outcome of congressional elections. And after that, we'll be able to explain why incumbents have such an advantage in getting reelected in Congress. So we will be spending our time today looking at how congressional elections protect those people who are already in power. The structure of the elections create these advantages for the incumbents, the guys that already hold office. So first, let's take a look at incumbency. We're just going to look at the things that incumbents have that their challengers do not, that give them advantages in elections. What we see here is Steve Cohen, representative from Memphis. He has won 8 congressional elections in a row now. You notice his slogan there: "Keep going with Cohen." So this is a good example of how incumbents have this advantage that they can advocate to the voters that it's best to keep them in office, and they'll continue to do a good job here. So here he is on his campaign for reelection. That was a successful campaign because he has many advantages over his challenger. Let's look at 3 different ways to categorize elections in Congress. These are ways that we would describe the competition level here and help us decide which congressional races are worth paying attention to in an election cycle. So first, we have what we call a safe seat. Now, a safe seat is a district in Congress or in the Senate, in the House of Representatives or the Senate, where there is almost no chance that the incumbent loses. Usually, what happens in a district like this, the district is overwhelmingly made up of Democrats, or the district is overwhelmingly made up of Republicans, and that creates a safe seat for the person running for reelection. A very, very safe election is an unopposed election. And this happens a lot. This happens in the House of Representatives pretty regularly. So one candidate is like seen as so unbeatable that no one even bothers to run against them. They don't want to waste the money. They don't want to waste the time and energy. There are several districts across the country where the Democrats don't even bother running against the Republican there. And there's several districts across the country where the Republicans don't bother running against a Democrat. In the most recent, the 2020 election, Jim Cooper is the representative for Nashville. And Nashville is so overwhelmingly Democratic that we would call his seat a safe seat. And Jim Cooper had done so well in the previous elections that this year the Republican Party decided not to even run anyone against him. So he ran unopposed. So when you went to vote on election day, you had a choice of Jim Cooper or no one. So that's what we call an unopposed election. He does not even have a challenger to run against. And then the opposite would be what we call an open seat. Now, an open seat is where there is no incumbent. So the incumbent that was there, the person who held office, has chosen to retire. Maybe they passed away. For some reason, they are not going to run for office again. And so there is no incumbent in the race. And this will attract many challengers to compete for that seat. This will attract several Democratic challengers and several Republican challengers because, as we will go on to see, it is so rare that a challenger can beat an incumbent to get into Congress that open seats are one of the only chances for turnover in Congress, one of the only chances to get a seat in Congress in the first place. Once you win that first election, it is very easy to continue winning elections. So much time and energy is put into open seat elections. They become very, very competitive. Democrats do everything they can to win the seat. Republicans do everything they can to win the seat. And so the cost of an open seat election is so expensive. And especially lately, they'll get more and more donors who are willing to chip in to win that seat for their political party. And as you guys probably noticed in the last election, that process is becoming a lot more national. Living in Memphis here, we see commercials for congressmen in Maine or in South Carolina or things like that. These are not races that we have any impact over at all, but those commercials are hoping that we will help donate money to the election campaigns of those candidates, even though they're so far away from us and we will never get a chance to vote on them. This is how important an open seat election can be. So the Democrats will do whatever they can to win that seat and keep that incumbency advantage, and the Republicans will do everything they can to win that seat and keep the incumbency advantage. And so these become the most competitive and the most expensive elections that we have for Congress. All right, let's take a look at some of the advantages that incumbents have in their congressional races. And then we're going to focus on the House and the Senate specifically to see what the differences are. But first of all, many incumbents, because they are successful in Congress or they are liked by their party, a lot of times incumbents will not even face challenges in their primaries. So if when we talk about a primary, we're trying to decide who is the candidate for the Democrats and who is the one candidate for the Republicans. So we're trying to narrow down all your options into one. If there's an incumbent in that race, oftentimes that person is going to be unchallenged in their own party. That allows them to save their money and their efforts for the big general election. So, like for example, in Memphis, it's possible that no Democrat runs against Steve Cohen for his seat. So he's able to save his campaign donations. He's able to save his energy and focus on the race. While in the meantime, we might have 2 or 3 or 4 Republicans fighting for the chance to go against Cohen. And they may be spending all their money on advertising and their campaigns and things like that. The biggest thing about incumbents, though, is they have name recognition. Like we know their names because you hear it in the news. They get like free attention because they're mentioned in news stories or on television, or they're just the congressman that you've heard of before. In congressional races, most people have no idea who the candidates are. So name recognition becomes the number one factor. This is actually why people put up yard signs. Yard signs, all they do typically is have the candidate's name on them, but they are effective because then your uninformed voter who feels like they need to go vote because it's their civic duty, they don't know anything walking into the poll, but they might have seen a lot of signs for a person like Steve Cohen, and then they go into the voting booth and they vote for that person because it's a name that they recognize. Incumbents in Congress also have the ability to claim credit, which their challengers usually don't. The people that are in Congress currently, they have a track record. They can point to the things that they have accomplished. The people that are running against them don't have that same opportunity. So they get to say, like, here's a thing I did for the district, while their challenger doesn't get to. The incumbents also are going to have a lot more money, usually. They tend to get more donations because people can trust them. People know that they will have been in office and things like that. The political action committees and super PACs are more likely to spend more money to keep them in office than to get a new person in there. We're going to talk about all these things a little more in a minute, but the one we'll only mention this one time here is the franking privilege. Remember that ability that congressmen have to mail for free. So doesn't seem like a huge deal, but if you think about it, that's like reaching a voter can cost 50 cents if we're talking about how much it would cost to mail someone. And so if you're trying to reach hundreds of thousands of voters, this is a big advantage for the incumbents. They can get their name out there. We already said name recognition is the most important thing. So if all you do is send a postcard with your name on it, that influences some voters, and that is a cost that the incumbents don't have to spend that their challengers do. They already have more money and they don't even have to spend it the same way. All right, so an important thing to learn about the House of Representatives is that the incumbents win their reelection almost 90% of the time. This chart goes back to 1964, goes through the 2018 elections, and shows us the rates at which the incumbents were re-elected to Congress. You see that number is always over 80, and it is usually up there in the 90% range. So on average, 90% of the House re-incumbents get elected. So that shows us what a huge advantage the incumbents have in Congress. Here we see one of the more confusing things about American voters. That last chart might make you think that Congress is really popular, but it turns out Congress is very, very unpopular almost all the time. Going back to 1974 on this chart, the voters' attitude towards Congress is really bad. They never get to 50% approval. So most voters almost always think Congress is doing a bad job. But then look at the blue line up at the top. That shows the reelection rate of each of the incumbents. So what that tells us is that people like their own congressman, but they don't like Congress. So the fact that Congress is very unpopular does not impact incumbents who run for reelection. People tend to think that their own congressman is a good congressman, but all the other congressmen are bad and terrible, and that's why Congress is awful. So this is a very weird thing about American voters. They tend to dislike Congress, but they continue to reelect the people that are already in Congress. This is another confusing chart here. This does show us a little bit of what we were just talking about. This shows us the light green line shows us whether the percentage of people that think their congressman should be reelected, and the darker green line shows the percentage that think other congressmen should be reelected. So you can see that American voters don't think that congressmen should be reelected. And even on their own congressmen, that number is just about 50%. However, as we've seen, 90% of those candidates that are running for reelection will be reelected to the House. So this is a very strange phenomenon among American voters here. We don't like Congress, but we like our congressman. We might not even think that our congressman deserves to be reelected, but we're going to go reelect them anyway. And so the House of Representatives is the place where the incumbency advantage is the biggest. So for House of Representatives incumbents, they're going to win reelection 90% of the time. In their races, they often get 60% of the vote even. That's how badly they win their race. So they're not even close races in most cases. But the House districts, the people running in the House districts have a much easier time winning re-election. The main thing for their race is the name recognition. A crazy thing about the United States is only 30% of people can even name their own representative to the House of Representatives. So the name recognition is a big deal. It's not at all weird for races in the House to be unchallenged. That means people running for reelection might not run against anyone. In the 2020 election, the representative from Nashville did not run against anyone. The Republicans didn't even bother to run someone against him. The districts for the House of Representatives are they can be gerrymandered, and so they're pretty safe. The districts are either overwhelmingly Democrat or overwhelmingly Republican. So the Democrat doesn't have a lot of competition, neither does the Republican. And also the other thing about the districts is they tend to be homogenous. They're very similar. So districts either be like all the way city or all the way rural, and it's easier to appeal to voters that way. So the House of Representatives incumbents have an advantage that way. When we take a look at the Senate, there's a similar pattern that the incumbents almost always get reelected, but the rate is a lot lower. The incumbency advantage in the Senate is not as strong as it is in the House of Representatives. So the Senate, while they are still very, very likely to be reelected to office, they're not as likely to be reelected as the members of the House. So on this chart, you can see that sometimes those numbers are actually like lower than 60%. It's rare, but the number is a lot closer to an 80% advantage, an 80% rate of being reelected than the 90% rate in the House. So some of the reasons for that in the Senate is the Senate districts are bigger. They're a lot more diverse. If you think about it, in a state, there's probably districts for the cities and districts for the rural areas, so the House people can focus on the city or focus on the rural voters. But in the Senate, you have to appeal to different types of voters across the entire state. The people who run against the Senate incumbents tend to be more well known. They're usually funded by groups called political action committees. They're usually picked out because they have such a good track record of winning elections in the past. So senators will have to run for re-election against like former governors or well-known mayors or other or members of the House. And so the senators have much more difficult races than the members of the House of Representatives. Also, since we talked about how the senators get a lot more media attention, when a senator does something bad, they get a lot of attention on that in a way that House representatives do not. Because House representatives are mostly anonymous, we don't really pay attention to their scandals. But in the Senate, we know about scandals from senators in states that aren't even close to here. So the senators have a tough time with that extra media attention. The other thing about the senators, because they get so much attention, they are so well known, people develop genuine opinions about them. People may have senators that they like and dislike, where in the House, the main thing that mattered is if people had heard your name before. In the Senate, that might be a bad thing. They might already have a bad attitude about you because of statements or stances you've taken in the past. So the senators facing reelection have a more difficult time winning over the voters. All right, so let's look at Tennessee just to understand the difference here. On the left, we see the elections for the House of Representatives, and there are the 9 districts in Tennessee, and the results of each race there. Down at the bottom is Steve Cohen in Memphis in District 9. He won the race by 57 points, which means that his percentage was 57% higher than his opponent, Charlotte Bergman. You see in District 5 in Nashville, they didn't even run anyone against Jim Cooper. Jim Cooper was so guaranteed to win that the Republicans did not run any candidate against him. And then in the other small districts, those Republican candidates destroyed their Democratic opponents. They were winning by 33% at the lowest. So these are huge, overwhelming victories for the Republicans in those 7 other districts. Over on the right, I can look at the Senate election in the House. The most recent one we have results for is the 2018 race between Marsha Blackburn and Phil Bredesen. Now, in this case, Marsha Blackburn won with 54% of the vote to Phil Bredesen's 43. That's a much closer race than any of these House races. You can see there on the map that there is Democratic support in the 2 big city areas, and there's some over in West Tennessee, but it is mostly Republican victories across the state. But the candidates have to try to appeal to the whole state there. So in the House, since the districts are small, they tend to benefit one party already. Those contests are not competitive contests, right? The House was 9 blowout elections. But in the Senate, that is a one competitive election because the candidates have to try to find ways to appeal to the voters in the whole state. So, in general, for both sets of incumbents in the House and the Senate, the incumbents have a much better ability to raise money because they are well known. They have relationships with donors already, they have relationships with the party already. So, recent history shows us that incumbents are more likely to get donations from political action committees. That's an important source of funding. Someone who's trying to challenge an incumbent is only going to have a good chance if they have a tremendous amount of funding for their campaign. And so we'll look at how much these races can cost. And the biggest thing that they have to spend money on is advertising. So advertising is very important and very expensive. Advertising is going to be what helps to get their name out, but it's expensive. They're going to have to find money to pay for ads on TV and radio, billboards and internet ads and things like that. And so in more competitive places, since there's demand from both sides, both candidates in the race, those ads become more and more expensive. So fundraising is one of the most important parts of a campaign, and it tends to be an advantage for the incumbents in the race. We mentioned this earlier. The incumbents have the ability to claim credit for what they've done for their district, which is something their challenger can't do. In the picture here, we see Lindsey Graham over on the right. He's cutting the ribbon on one of his pork barrel projects here. So this is one of the reasons pork barrel projects are important. They have benefited the congressman's district. They've brought money or jobs into the economy. And so the congressman running for reelection can say to the voters, I did this for you. He or she can point at a local project and say, this is what I did as the congressman. And that's something that the challenger just cannot compete with. Casework is another one of those things. Casework wins over individual voters' loyalty because that congressman did you a favor. Many of you may be applying for one of the military academies. And in order to do that, you'll need to get a recommendation from one of your congressmen. And that's the thing where a congressman does you a specific favor. You probably are going to be more likely to vote for that congressman when they run for election because they did something nice for you. So this is something that the congressmen, the incumbents, have the ability to do, and their challengers usually do not. So because of the money advantage, they tend to have an advertising advantage too. That to still the main way to reach voters is to put an ad on TV. Even though you guys might not watch that much TV, old people do, and old people vote. So if they want to reach the most likely voters, they're going to spend money on television advertising. Candidates have to pay for all of their airtime. So they will have to raise money for their campaign to be able to play their commercials and stuff like that. But other groups, these are new groups called super PACs, they are also allowed to pay for additional airtime. So a super PAC is a officially unrelated to the campaign, but they're still trying to advocate for someone in the election. So the candidate's ad will feature the candidate saying, I approve this message, right? I'm Ted Cruz and I approve this message. I'm George Bush and I approve this message. I'm Barack Obama, I approve this message. But the Super PAC ad will not have that message. And that's how we know it's from an outside group. They're not allowed to coordinate with the campaign. So we're going to get way into Super PACs at the end of the course in the spring here. But Super PACs are they're likely to attack opponents and things like that. They can't really say vote for this candidate or vote against this candidate, but they can say things like Steve Cohen is a terrible congressman, and here's why. So the advertising is a really, really important factor in the congressional elections, and it's just another place where the incumbents have an advantage because they tend to have more money. All right, that is a lot just dealing with incumbents in congressional elections. That is the main thing we need to know about congressional elections. So just remember that the incumbents have several advantages and remember the advantages that they have. We're going to continue to talk about elections in Congress by starting to talk about midterm elections, and then we're going to look specifically at the implications of reapportionment and redistricting in the House elections.